There we go. Okay, well, over to you, Peggy.
Absolutely. We're ready to rock and roll, James. Thanks so much, first of all, for inviting me to moderate this very exciting session because we're all here to learn, and what better place because we've got the experts for it. As you said, James, I'm Peggy Unsaltz. I'm your host today, your moderator. I'm the founder of Mobile Groove, and we're looking at fingerprinting because, hey, fingerprinting, yes, it was the workaround many marketers used to arrive at the best guess about ads that drove user actions and make that connection. So right way, wrong way, who cares? It's disappearing. That's the point. And so marketers are confronted with the question, hey, what do we do next? How do they prepare? What do they do to succeed with the data they have? And is it maybe an apocalypse? Apocalypse? Pun intended? No, not really. Tough questions that we have today, but that's why we have our panel of experts who are here to offer actionable answers. So again, to your point, James, and everyone, use your chat. Your questions matter. And our panel, I know, loves a challenge. So let's just bring it on. And when I introduce you, maybe raise your hand and wave. So I'll kick it off with Adam. Adam Landis, head of growth at Branch, with the brand behind him, looking great. Adam currently serves as head of growth at Branch, as I said, where he spends his time with customers, partners, and product teams, helping steer the company's focus amid, as he puts it, the chaos of the mobile market. He's seen it from all sides, and late last year, his company, Ad Libertas, was acquired by Branch, where he spent 8 years as CEO building it up. And we did an interview, actually, at the time that news was announced, back in October. And this webinar is a bit of an encore on that because, Adam, you foresaw much of what we are discussing today. And a little bit of a personal note, well, it marks Adam's 14th year in mobile app advertising in 2024. Over that time, he spent a lot of time on the buy side, the sell side, the data, the analytics, and measurement as it is now. May sound very complex to you, but that's the thing about Adam. I think he thrives on it. His guilty pleasure, constant change, which may give some of us headaches out there, well, he thinks it is what keeps life interesting. So we're looking forward to an edgy and interesting conversation with you, Adam. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you,
And
Peggy.
great to have you. And as I said, edgy. We're not over-promising here. Sergio Serra, product head of Inmobi's DSP. Sergio, hello. He oversees the demand side proposition for performance advertisers, which is probably best known for leading the market on innovation around Apple's Scan NAD network. He'll be talking about that, of course. What we don't know, he's also recognized as a leader in privacy reform, so a great fit here. He's collaborated on industry-wide projects such as Privacy Sandbox for Android, talking about it again, a great fit, and also represents Inmobi on some of the most important groups for measurement, addressability, and programmatic supply chain in the IAB. Personal note here, Sergio is Italian. Yes, we see that. He loves Italian food, which is what you would expect, a little bit stereotypical, but untypical, does not care for garlic. So Sergio, you clearly break the mold when it comes to stereotypes, and here you are to blow our mind by knocking down some perceptions, some stereotypes about advertiser perceptions. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Thanks. So I think we can get started. And for everybody, hi everybody. I hope you will enjoy this webinar. And there is an icon on the top right, and over there you will be able to see some questions. And why don't you guys let us know what is your readiness when it comes to scan, and then we will go ahead and share what our findings are. Okay, I can see votes coming in. So where are you at when it comes to your scan adoption journey? I can see, wow, votes are coming in. So people are using both scan and probabilistic attribution, seems to be the majority, and then is followed by using probabilistic attribution. And that's pretty much consistent to what we are seeing. And again, in a bit, we will go through those slides. But yeah, results seems to be consistent. 15% not started. Wow, guys, that's why we are here. But that's good. And I'm just wondering if there is a way to go to the next question.
Search here with the cursors should take you onto the next. Has that worked? Yeah, there you go.
Oh.
Brilliant.
Okay, perfect.
Yep.
Yeah, I was just checking if the new question will also come on the right. But okay, so I think we can get started. So at T-Mobile, we partner with advertiser perceptions, right, to survey roughly 250 performance marketers, and the questions are the same as the ones you guys are seeing on screen on the right. And I think the very first interesting finding is that 53% of the people are using both scan and probabilistic attribution. I know that the majority of the audience here will know what probabilistic attribution is, but we will zoom into it in a bit. Another 19% is using scan as the sole source for attribution, but then a whopping 27% hasn't started to play around with scan and is majorly just using probabilistic attribution. Now, when we go into the whys, right? So why are people using a probabilistic attribution over scan, for instance? Keep in mind these a multi-option question. So the majority of the people, according to our survey, is stating that it's just easier for them to keep going with probabilistic attribution, which is something we can understand because it's less disruptive in nature. Then the second reason is that scan performance is lower and costs are higher. Then scan is too complicated. And finally, another 21% of the people said, scan doesn't give me visibility into ROAS. So I think nothing really surprising as far as the results are concerned, at least from my end. That's exactly what I would expect. But then when we go to the next slide, and the distinction between probabilistic attribution and fingerprinting, interestingly, just half of the people know that probabilistic attribution may be considered as fingerprinting, but another one third essentially is really saying that I'm not aware that fingerprinting is actually that fingerprinting is considered as probabilistic attribution. And finally, 17% is unaware of what fingerprinting is, and that's exactly what we are going to fix during this webinar. Now, going to the next slide, when we go to trying to understand whether people know that Apple is planning on cracking down on fingerprinting, right? And what they are trying to do. Well, people say that, in like 20% of the people say that they are familiar, they are very familiar, 36% somewhat familiar, and then again, almost another half is in between aware of the changes, but not very familiar, and finally, 16% is not at all familiar with the changes, right? So with these, we can actually go to the $1 million question, which is, hey, what strategy are you going to adopt when it comes to scan, right? In 2024, essentially. So 27% of the people plan to fully move to scan attribution in 2024, and a whopping 60% is actually adopting a wait and see approach. In that they want to be reactive, essentially, right? Based on what Apple will do, they will course correct, which is something we will normally not really endorse from our side, because we would like people to be, of course, prepared as soon as possible. And then 14% of the people are just stating no plans to shift strategies at this time, right? So I think now with this out of the way, we can try to understand a bit more what fingerprinting is, right? And maybe we can also draw the connection with probabilistic attribution. So essentially, probabilistic attribution is one way of using fingerprinting. And fingerprinting is coming into picture whenever you don't have a deterministic ID to actually tie back to a user. And what fingerprinting involves is to essentially take some supply signals, so some data signals that can be concatenated together from the user and used to create a key that tries to identify the user across websites or apps, even without a specific device ID. So let's look at these data points. For instance, you have the IP address, you have the handset, you have the storage space, you have the user keyboards right on the phone. So the trade-off here is, of course, the more data points you add to this fingerprinting key and you concatenate together, the more reliable this is in terms of identifying one-on-one a user. But of course, the more data points you add, the less durable this fingerprinting key is, because, for instance, the disk space might vary, in a matter of hours or days. Same thing for the IP address, right? So again, the whole takeaway from this is that fingerprinting is a way to still track the user, even in the absence of a device ID. Now, let's try to understand why fingerprinting is on the chopping block today. I mean, first thing first, as is very easy to think. I believe that not giving the optionality to the user is simply not cool, right? So today, when it comes to device ID, the user can simply opt out and decide not to pass anymore the device ID. When it comes to fingerprinting, the user doesn't have that flexibility. So it's not privacy safe as such. The second thing, as we mentioned in the previous slide, is that it becomes a probabilistic way of targeting and doing attribution, as opposed to having a consistent device ID, which is more deterministic in nature. And again, as a segue, we already spoke about the data points, but it heavily relies on IP, and the IP is not persistent, especially if you are on the go. Finally, it's clearly prohibited by both Apple and Google. So moving into the next slide, I think now it makes a lot of sense to understand the different approaches that both companies, Google and Apple, are actually taking in order to crack down on fingerprinting. So when it comes to Apple, Apple is taking an approach that is very interesting, which is rather based on enforcing their policy rather than making fundamental changes to the platform. So what I mean by that is, if we try to look at what Apple launched in 2020, among the other innovations, there was something called Apple's privacy nutrition labels, which are essentially labels for the users that user can consume either before downloading the app or after having downloaded the app, that include all the data points that the publisher is collecting about the user, right? So essentially, you have what type of data the app or the SDK is trying to collect, why this data is being collected, and whether it's linked to user tracking or not, and who else has access to this data. But with like in the last quarter, Apple also introduced something called privacy manifest, right? So privacy manifests are essentially files that now are supposed to be created by both the publisher as well as the third-party SDKs the publisher work with, and they exactly include this data we just spoke about. But the important thing is that up until Q2, right, it wasn't really possible for the publisher, although the publisher, by the way, is clearly defined as 100% accountable and liable for any code, third-party code that they put into their app. It was very hard for the publisher to actually understand and have 100% clarity into what the third-party SDKs he or she works with will try to capture in terms of data points, right? Because remember, on some extent, a third-party SDK is a black box for the publisher. They just integrate it into their properties or into their app. So now the SDK developer is also supposed to fill in the privacy manifest as well as the publisher. And Apple introduced also something called privacy report, that allows, at the time of compiling, allows the publisher to retrieve the summary of all the privacy manifest, so that they can add this data into the nutrition labels that we just spoke about. So these nutrition labels become very insightful for the users, and the users can then take a more educated call on whether they want to take the app or not. There is also another addition, which is required reason APIs. So some APIs that are that belongs to the platform, so to Apple in this case, are deemed to be high risk for fingerprinting by Apple. So an example can be, checking the last time the system was rebooted, or the disk space, as I was mentioning, or the different active keyboards, right? So now publishers and SDK developers will be still able to use those, but they have to justify within a list of potential reasons why they want to use this API. So for instance, if you are downloading as a user a Torch app, right, a Flash app, do they really need to check your disk space or the number of keyboards you really have, right? So as a user, you can now look into this data and see and think about whether this actually resonates well or not, and take a more educated call on whether you still want to have that app or not. So that's the gist of this word release from Apple. Now, on the other end, we have on the other side of the spectrum, actually, you have another approach that is more fundamental when you think about it, right? And essentially, what Google is doing with Privacy Sandbox, and specifically SDK runtime, they are trying to take the SDK out of the publisher app so that it can operate in a more siloed environment. So let me just elaborate. Before zooming into this, we need to understand that Android inherits something called app sandboxing from Linux. So what this means is that every app will essentially be given an ID, and it will be given a specific capacity in terms of memory and storage, right? Up until today, whenever an app developer includes an SDK into their own app, that specific sandbox, and so memory and storage, are shared across the SDKs that the publisher decided to work with. Now, with SDK runtime, what will happen is that SDK will be given by Android a different runtime environment, right? So the publisher will be gatekeeper on that extent, and finally be able to decide the permissions that the third-party SDKs can get, instead of automatically inheriting those permissions from the publisher. Because remember, until today, SDK plus app live in the same sandbox, right? Live in the same runtime, essentially. So that's a very fundamental change, and I would say slightly more complicated than what Apple is trying to do. Now, just to conclude, let's look at the timeline, right? So Q3, which is the previous quarter, is when Apple announced Privacy Manifest. In Q4, Apple will start sending emails to developers, highlighting whether there are unjustified calls to these required reason APIs. And then in Q2 2024, the expectation is that Apple will begin the enforcement of Privacy Manifest, right? So it will be mandatory. And after that, it will be more and more difficult to do fingerprinting. As far as Android is concerned, they presented Privacy Sandbox for Android. Google presented Privacy Sandbox for Android in February 2022. Then they announced SDK runtime. And what we can probably speculate is that in 2024, they will also start, making more available at scale these functionalities, including SDK runtime. So like the availability of a permanent advertising ID, like the GIID, or semi-permanent, I should rather say, will become more difficult, most likely. Okay, so I think before going into the Q&A, I just wanted to reiterate that we, in Mobi as a company, we are here to help and essentially to help you guys, marketers and advertisers, navigate to the difficulties of these privacy innovations, which are in multiple ways actually positive for the whole ecosystem and the users, right? So you can come to our website, download our guides. And for any further clarification, right, you can simply hit us up at performance@inmobi.com. And with that, Peggy, I think I will hand it over to you for the Q&A session. And you are on mute.
Am I here?
Now, yes.
Okay, confirmed. And I should be all right. Okay, I love it when it's live. No, that was great, Sergio. Thanks for making it above all so understandable. And that was what stuck out in my mind. The shocker in all of that is how many marketers are following a wait and see strategy. So I wanted to start there because it sounds like a safe bet, but probably isn't. What are marketers losing here besides like the clock ticking away?
Yeah, so at least in my mind, I think the most important thing they are losing is time, right? Because as of today, as a marketer, you have device ID to test again any new marketing campaign that you want to execute in the absence of a device ID. But tomorrow, whenever these policies will be enforced, most likely the device ID will not be available. So you should rather start testing today, make sure that things are working, and if they are not, you still have the device ID to see how to better improve maybe your aggregation layer or the type of
Okay, sorry, as you know, I'm not in my office, so I'm in the middle of a Unilever party, and they're all catering, so I hope you could hear and I could get rid of some of the background. I did want to follow up with one thing because, yes, it's time, so that means it's time for testing, and testing is really important to prepare. And I guess we could all argue that we lost time and adoption's been very spotty because of that. It's because of how SCAN was introduced, basically. How has SCAN evolved since its inception? Just to backtrack and be very clear on that.
Yeah, so I think, look, honestly, if you look at SCAN in 2018, which is SCAN 1, the first iteration they had, it was fundamentally unusable, right? Because you didn't have conversion value, you didn't even have the source app, right, as a feedback. So you couldn't know where and how to spend more money, essentially in specific supply buckets. But I think Apple has been doing good iterative work. So SCAN 2 was really what moved the needle because they introduced the conversion value and some additional functionalities. But I think that the main point is that the way Apple tried to gain more traction for SCAN was really working the device ID, right? So without ATT, they just left the option. Now, SCAN 3 is also very important because it gives you a sense of multi-touch attribution, right? Of course, in the previous version on SCAN 2.2, they also started to support VTA attribution, which again wasn't there since inception. And with SCAN 4, we are also seeing multiple postback and more granular data, of course, with some level of crowd anonymity tiers, which is their internal definition to allow advertisers to get more data while privacy but I think it's a framework that has been from unusable to actually finally being in a very interesting shape.
Okay. We are live, so we do have some questions here, and it's a great follow-up because you were just talking about how this was introduced. And so the question is from one of the attendees here, then how strictly do you think Apple will enforce privacy manifests? Will there be a grace period like we had in the past? And maybe you weigh in on this, but also you, Adam, because I'm sure you have an opinion on this as well.
Yeah, my very quick answer would be that I don't think they will be as flexible because they are now allowing publishers to test as we speak. And then Q2 is when they will probably enforce this as per their commitment. So usually they are fairly religious to that, to those commitments. But Adam, I'm keen to understand your perspective here.
I agree. I think that Google is more likely to delay on Google Privacy Sandbox, whereas Apple, when they make a decision, they go through with it. Now, any grace period that can or will exist is just going to be how strictly they enforce their policies. And the enforcement policies really are less going to be likely to give people a chance to catch up on fingerprinting, and more likely for Apple to get their enforcement mechanism right. I do want to call something out. Now, Branch is an MMP, and earlier in the poll, there was a probabilistic equals MMP. That's not always the case, and your MMP may not be fingerprinting. Branch has taken a very staunch, non-fingerprinting, non-probabilistic approach. So don't think that just because you're using an MMP means that you can no longer use that MMP or you use measurement coming from your MMP.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I think it's definitely very important for people to understand that even within MMPs, right, you can access and get reporting on both scan as well as non. And then there are some MMPs like yourself that made a very clear stance on privacy.
Well, there's three sources of measurement that's not including probabilistic. There's opt-in, so any opt-ins you have, and that's like the silver bullet, both for privacy, but also for any kind of data policy protection. So any opt-ins you get, you can track users deterministically. You get information from your reporting networks, or your self-attributing networks, or your networks that have just regular reporting, and then you have scan reporting. And those three measurements together give you your sense of signal that doesn't violate Apple's policy.
So there are data signals there, but our audience wants to understand, is it really therefore possible to measure ads only with scan data? And if so, how?
Adam, you want to take that? Or
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
So possible, yes. Recommended, probably not, because by nature, scan is built and designed to restrict the amount of signal that you get, so you can't link a user between the advertisement and where they install. So you won't have perfect measurements, so therefore you do want to increase your ability to triangulate where that user comes from. And when you are using scan, you will have to change the mechanisms or back into the scan framework, given the purposely built limitations, to take your end goal KPIs and back them into what scan's limitations allow. So for instance, we have a customer that has a 37-day subscription event that they optimize towards. On Scan 4, you can only do 35 days, and that's the absolute maximum signal you can get from install. So 37 days disallows them from using Scan. So what they've done is they've changed our KPI mechanism to say, well, you know what? Since we can't get measurement on 37 days, we're going to look at a proxy mechanism that will allow us to look at success signals that indicate a potential 37-day window or 37-day subscription sign on. And looking at their app, they have it's a 7-day free trial, and then 30-day free trial that allows them 7 days to go into, which is why they're looking for 37 days. So instead, they look for a 7-day opt into the free trial, and from there they can approximate that 37-day conversion event. And that's a mechanism that you can use for Scan to get signal out, to measure using Scan. But again, that's about using your KPIs and backing into how Scan will work.
Again, a lot of questions here, so I'm going to go into them. I have my questions too, but they have ones that are going very deep in the weeds, and I think you're just the experts for this. So where does probabilistic assumptions from web server logs and API traffic fit with this mix? So again, those approximations, those assumptions. Who wants to take that?
I'll try.
Adam?
So yeah, the probabilistic assumptions from web server logs API traffic. Now that can be generated from two ways. That can be generated from the actual MMP. So the MMP is actually doing the probabilistic assumptions, and this is just theory. I don't actually know this, but this is kind of like the generally held theory. The MMP is doing this to maximize signal coming out of this traffic. Now Branch, again, does not do this. So I'm talking just kind of what I would hypothesize. So the MMP would be doing that, and to the end user, they can basically turn, the end user being the advertiser in this case, they can essentially turn a blind eye and say, well, I'm getting measurement, I don't really need to worry about it. These are the people that are most at risk, because if you're just blindly trusting your MMP to deliver data and you have no idea if it's probabilistic or fingerprinting or not, then come cutoff, all of a sudden that traffic is going to either disappear or you're going to get booted from the App Store. Now, if you're doing your own log matching and your own web server traffic probabilistic matching, that's an entirely different ballgame. That means you're actively fingerprinting on your own, and privacy manifests, the APIs, the things that Sergio was talking about, are designed to preclude you from doing that. Basically preclude you from getting the information you need to probabilistically match. Now, in theory, it will restrict you. In practice, it's probably going to take a lot of workarounds to actually create. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say fingerprinting will be possible after this mandate. It will just become a lot more difficult to do. And if you get caught, which will be likely because there will be people trying to police this, you'll get booted from the App Store. So there will have to be a decision that the app makes, who's currently using probabilistic matching, whether they know it or not, to actually proactively go around the Apple policies where today they can just look the other way. And I think that's the big indicator that we're going to see, is people are going to start to say, hey, what is my MMP doing and what do I need to do to prepare for it?
Because your work, oh,
you got it.
Sorry. Okay. Someone got me now. I'm good. So I want to continue with that thought, Adam, because that's it. You're working with customers who are doing this, and you're seeing sort of who's doing it right, who's doing it the right way, you know, the ethical way, also who's doing it successfully. Might not be the same thing. And those who are laggers aren't doing it at all. Maybe you can share some of the approaches, some of the strategies that each of these groups is following. Maybe start with the easy one, the successful ones.
Well, I'm going to edit your question a bit and say ethical versus non-ethical. Since Branch only works with customers.
Okay.
So I will say effective. Let's say people using Scan effectively versus people that are kind of lagging and falling back. So people that are using Scan effectively are really understanding the limitations the complexity gives them. They're leaning into what their vendors or their technology vendors, technology partners are doing to get around that. That's Sergio talking about what Inmobi's doing, Branch talking about what the limitations are. And they're designing their campaign success criteria, campaign KPIs to work within that framework. So I've mentioned the 37-day example. That's an example of someone who's changing their campaign APIs to work within Scan. And then another important aspect of success is being able to communicate within the organization the limitations of this effect. Now, I'll say someone that was very early on was looking at Scan's limitations, there's a food delivery app in Europe, large food delivery app, and we're going through the conversion value schema, and this gentleman looks at me in kind of exasperation, goes, how am I going to tell my CMO that I cannot return ad spend numbers anymore? I can't give him a return on his budgetary. But the fact that he's having that conversation early and going to the CMO and saying, you know how I returned 137% of ad dollars you gave me on iOS campaigns? I can't do that anymore. Now my return is going to be anywhere between 80%, 150% because I can't exactly measure that or whatever number it is. But that's a critical difference. So the people that are lagging, there's two types. The first, they're not understanding the complexity. They aren't being able to garner the resources to actually implement the technology. So they're losing the valuable limited signal they can get, and they have no idea what to measure. And then a year later, when they go to the CMO, they say, I can't tell the results on my campaigns. That makes them look bad, and that's where people are lagging behind. Now, the secondary laggard, and I find that the most of our customers are in the secondary bucket, is that increased signal for profitability on a campaign isn't really going to help them achieve their goals. The best example of someone that can be kind of forgiven for not having the boned up Scan influence would be someone like a quick serve restaurant. So like choose your poison there, McDonald's, Pizza Hut, Burger King. Someone installing an app with a quick serve restaurant does not give them an ROI on that install. You put $1 towards the install. The person might make an order in a Burger King or in a McDonald's app, but they're not likely going to put all of their lifetime value in the app. They're going to go to a McDonald's in Vegas. They're going to go to McDonald's on a road trip. They're going to see McDonald's along the way. And so it doesn't matter. There's no conversion value schema that will give them the ROI on the app install. It's a much more holistic approach towards what they're doing for branding. And they can be forgiven for not really having a boned up scan conversion value schema, because that's not going to help them get better measurement out of their outcome anyway.
You're giving recommendations as well, Sergio, to people who are, adopting scan, dealing with it, dealing with these issues. How do you go about giving recommendations to your clients working with scan? And also, and Moby saw this coming. You have something called an ad-based, scan-based ad bidder. Where does that all fit in the recommendations of, as Adam's pointing out, the routes that you need to take?
Yeah, no. So I think that's a very fair question, and I also appreciate what Adam just mentioned, because the reality is that the paradigm of doing marketing is changing, right? So as you move away from user level targeting and attribution, of course, there are some compromises that are not necessarily bad, as Adam was mentioning. It's just a different way of looking at your performance that could be more holistically evaluated now. When it comes to Inmobi, right, and we have obviously pulse of competition and what they are doing, because the clients are very likely to work with multiple DSPs. So I think the call we made was to start fresh from zero, which is exactly what a scan bidder for us is doing. So instead of trying to adapt our technology and move away from user ID and reuse the same algos for non-user ID targeting, we decided to rewrite from scratch our old algos. And now user ID is no longer a first-class citizen for us when it comes to our scan bidder. Like, don't get me wrong, everything is still possible, but for us, we are really doubling down, and we have been doubling down on privacy. So we separated out our modules. So now what this means is that without user ID or fingerprinting in this case, we are still able to look at the pockets where most of the ROI, or the ROAS in this case, is for the advertiser, but trying to exploit those buckets at the supply cut level. So what this means is that you no longer look at user IDs, but you look at cohorts, right? And you can infer those cohorts based on, as I said, different supply cuts that could be all the way from the bundle to time of the day. And I think the key really is how you leverage the campaign IDs, right, that you can create with Scan, because of course there is a trade-off as a DSP as well between giving certain flexibility to advertiser plus MMPs for their own optimization and attribution purposes, but at the same time you also need to make sure that your bidder is able to optimize and have a feedback from Apple. Now, of course, fortunately with Scan 4, the number of campaign IDs of course grew at a much higher level, but until Scan 3, right, that was a massive problem, because out of 100 campaigns you had to live with this trade-off. And so yes, as far as the recommendation goes, I think the best recommendation I can give is to make sure you're working with an MMP that understands of course privacy and gives the right flexibility, and B, work with a DSP that has rebuilt their own stack from scratch as we did, because I don't think if you try to pivot starting from an old stack that is based on user ID, you can actually achieve the same goals, because you are going to always compromise, right? So you have to start fresh and rebuild your technology.
So always a bit of a trade-off, looking for a balance, but we do have some time to do that. I want to switch gears and talk about Android privacy sandbox and how advertisers should be getting ready for that as well. We want to take it maybe with starting with you, Sergio.
Sure.
Pointed that out.
Maybe we can start with that clear distinction between privacy sandbox and Scan in general, because usually they are both put in opposite side of the spectrums, right? But the way I look at this is that privacy sandbox is a whole advertising suite, right? While Scan is just an attribution framework. Then of course you can add ATT in the whole mix. But if you think about Scan, right, Scan is just the attribution framework. Privacy Sandbox is the clear outcome of a different operating model. So Google has been the emblem of open source, right? And open innovation as such, while you have Apple that has been since inception the emblem of closed innovation. And this reflects into their roadmap and their products. So I think Apple tried to unilaterally release Scan, and we also all paid the cost of that because we had to live with some deficiencies, right? Google is trying to do the opposite. It's trying to get feedback from community. It's trying to do the right thing since the beginning. One might argue, hey, you will never do the right thing until you launch. But I really appreciate how Google is going about, developing these frameworks. We have been working on a weekly basis with Google. We have been testing their APIs, and I'm very positive because this is going to be a more breaking change when it comes to Privacy Sandbox, but less disruptive because they are also providing alternative means to cover all the use cases. So Privacy Sandbox includes means for targeting, retargeting, attribution, and crackdown on fingerprinting, which is what SDK runtime is doing and what I was talking about. But in the interest of time, I think I will also let Adam chime in. I know that
I think I'll echo what you're saying. I'll put it more bluntly, which is I look at incentives. So Google is an advertising company. They're incentivized to release a product that allows effective advertising. Apple is not an advertising company, and when they released Scan 2, it was barely usable. Scan 4 is slightly better, but then when you look at like Scan 4, it was released a year ago, and be like, why is it taking so long? Like, why are we still on webinars talking about Scan 4? Like, the reason is because it's imperfect. It's not a great product. Whereas Google Privacy Sandbox will be a better product, but it's taking a lot longer to implement. And Sergio, if I go back to your previous point talking about your campaign IDs on Scan, that's exactly what I was saying, was to rely on your technology partners. What you were just talking about is the investments that Mobi is making to target better given limitations of Scan. Now, that's not necessarily something that your customers need to know other than you've taken care of it and you're doing what you possibly can. And that's key for Privacy Sandbox. It's going to be way more complicated than Scan, like way more complicated. You read the tech spec, it's like ridiculous. But the technology vendors leading in are going to make sure that the efficacy of marketing is going to be better than Scan probably 4 today, immediately when it launches, which is still TBD, right?
100%. Agree.
So I want to follow up on that because, and also ask some questions. We are running out of time, Sully, but we do have some questions popping up. With fingerprinting evolving in 2024, how should advertisers prepare to effectively utilize first-party data for targeting and personalization while ensuring compliance with data privacy regulations and maintaining user trust? Big question. I read a book about that one. What strategies is the point here? What strategies can be employed to maximize the benefits of first-party data in this context?
I'll jump in because I just want to clarify.
Yes.
So first-party data, when it comes to Apple's policies, is very usable. Like, you can use your first-party data, and first-party data is defined as data that you, as the advertiser, collect on your own app within your own boundaries. And Apple defines that as apps that are under the same publisher umbrella. So technically, you'd use information from one app to the other as long as they're under the same publisher ID, and they actually give you a deterministic identifier that you can use to link those users together. That is legal under the Apple framework. So when it comes to app analytics, you're perfectly allowed to use that. Now, we're not talking about privacy policies like EU right now. Facebook's getting sued for doing this exact thing. Voodoo is getting sued for doing the exact thing. But under fingerprinting, you should absolutely use first-party data as much as you possibly can, as well as opt-in third-party data, which is if you get the user to opt in and you pass that information on, it still can be used for targeting, very much allowed under the Apple guise. So use your data to provide a better app experience. That's one thing you can possibly do, absolutely do with first-party data, and then get opt-ins to pass data on where you can for better targeting.
Yeah, I mean, I will definitely agree. And first-party data is going to be king, right? That's also what we have been seeing in terms of consolidation in the ecosystem. Companies, acquiring other companies, game studios acquiring smaller game studios, because at the end of the day, especially if you want to sell media within your own ecosystem, right? You have much lesser limitations compared to third party for the reasons that Adam is also talking about. And that's why I'm also very positive in the case of Immobi. We have a massive repository of apps and user bases. Like think of Glance, I think you Peggy are familiar, or Roposo, and we will be able to use that data. We already see the value of that. So I think you definitely need a very different and abstracted out strategy when it comes to first party data. But in my mind, it's going to be king.
This is just for me as a follow-up, but other than the focus on first party data, are there approaches or work that you can transfer from one to the other? Because we've got marketers that are saying, oh no, I've got to deal with SCAN, and then I've got Privacy Sandbox coming, we sort of know when, but we don't really sort of know when, and you don't want to reinvent the wheel. So are there approaches that you can recommend, or you're even seeing your customers using and saying, if I do this once, I'll have it set for later?
Yeah, so to me, looking at the two technologies, they're very, very different technologies, but the mentality that the marketer needs to go to is going to be very much shared between them. I heard a customer talking a couple of weeks ago in New York. They said, measurement is dead, the future is signal. And it's a key differentiation that applies across both of these technology frameworks, which is no longer will the performance optimizer be jumping into a spreadsheet and looking at optimization on certain campaigns. That's going to all be taken care of through machine learning, broad-based algorithms. Now they're going to be working on lower funnel events and optimizing user onboarding, or spending more time building better retention mechanisms or re-engagement mechanisms into the application. Those are both mentalities that will need to be transformed through the entire marketing organization and framework and ideal in the company. And what you learn on SCAN will absolutely be able to be applicable in Google Privacy Sandbox when, not if, it rolls out.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. And, I think that the underlying assumption is going to be the same across both platforms, right? You don't optimize any longer at the user ID level, right? So I think, interest-based advertising is going to be, of course, very important. You're going to reevaluate certain signals that maybe you were taken for granted and not actively using. Now you can throw them at the kitchen sink and just make sure that your ML algos are actually optimizing towards those. So things like different feature in your creative, different trends in the way the users are clicking at a cohort level, right? So you can use all these insights and factor them into your bidding logic. But I feel this is going to be common across both platforms. Again, there will be limitations, maybe more on Apple or on Google. This doesn't matter, but the underlying assumption is the same. You are going to go a level out when it comes to targeting and attribution.
So I'm just going to look for a few last questions. We are going to get to wrap it up soon, but I'm curious, having both of you here, I have to ask you, imagine we're coming together in another 6 months and we're doing a webinar, maybe not entirely on this topic, but it will be still around this because it will still be very fresh. I mean, can you give me a view into how all this is going to play out? Because I've been to conferences where they have the devil's advocate question, which is like, why don't we just wait and we'll do triple M, and it'll all be over and we won't have to, we'll just bypass it. And I'd love to hear what you have to say, starting maybe with you, Adam. Blunt answer to that.
So media mix modeling is valid, but it's more correctly used for budgeting today. It doesn't have quite the, even with included incrementality testing, it doesn't quite have the optimization output. I think in 6 months and a year, when we sit down and do another webinar, we're going to be talking about how to get the most effective signal, strategies for getting the most effective signal out of the limitations of SCAN, which will be the next version of the strategy. Right now, we're trying to educate the market on you can't look at fingerprinting, you can't look at deterministic measurement. Next time, it's going to be like, well, okay, what are you doing? What are some of the campaign budgets? How are you optimizing campaign budgets to maximize signal? How are you building a marketing funnel to maximize signal and increase the speed in which you can optimize? And the farther we go down this education path, the more advanced we can talk about how to actually use the limitations to your advantage.
Yeah, and I think the larger point for me is that I don't think anybody has, of course, the crystal ball to exactly say when these changes will be 100% enforced, right? Especially when it comes to privacy sandbox. But the reality is that they are happening. Is really a matter of when. So the biggest innovations usually come with people really start innovating and investing into technologies, and that's why I think we have the duty, right, as an ad ecosystem, to incentivize people into testing out this framework, so that whenever the enforcement actually comes, people don't go through shocks, right, as it happened in the case of Scan and ATT in the past. So I think we have an edge when it comes to Google. As we say, they're being definitely more open. So everybody should subscribe to the beta and embrace these new paradigms, in my mind.
Embrace the change. That's it. And it's going to be exciting to hear what those signals are very soon, because that's where the real innovation is going to come, to your point, Adam. I think it's a great idea to wrap up. I don't know, maybe Sergio, giving it back to you, just maybe to tell people who are there, and there are hundreds of attendees there, again, where they might get some information around your PowerPoint and your presentation again. I'll give it back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as we mentioned in the previous slides, now I don't have access to the slide anymore. I think James is controlling, but we did leave some link to our website. So if you come to the Mobi website, you can. Oh, thank you, James. You can refer to these specific repositories. So one is to get the guide, but more importantly, I would just encourage everybody going to the Mobi website, check us out, and if you need any clarification, you can send us an email to performance@mobi.com, and I'm sure our team will be more than happy to help you through this journey.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone. Thank my panel for a great presentation. Above all, so educational, a little bit edgy. We didn't overpromise. And thank you for attending. And thank you, James, for being the wonderful host of hosts that you are.
Thanks, Peggy. Thanks, Sergio. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Great discussion. Thanks.